So by doing that David Beckham activity, hopefully I've introduced a little bit of what we're looking at in terms of strategy, but I just want to give you a little bit more of an in-depth overview and some certain things that we want to relate it to. So we're going to look at what strategy is, and we're going to relate it back to things like objectives. So here's the key word that we have to keep remembering now when we're talking about this final module, F297, it's the word strategy. So for me, strategy is this idea of a management perspective. So it's an overview. It considers both long and short term. So no longer now are you just looking at marketing, you're looking at the whole business as a manager, remember. So a manager wouldn't just look at short term, wouldn't just look at long term, they would look at everything. They would look at an overview. So remember I said that F291 and F292 were very broad, but they didn't go into very much detail. So you looked at all the 4 functional areas, so marketing, production, finance and HR. F293 looked at one thing in depth. F297 looks at everything. So it takes into account the 4 functional areas, the impact that they have on each other, so how they all impact one another, and how all of those work together to impact the future. So a strategy must be decided upon. So first of all we have to think about where we want to be, and then once we've decided where we want to be, our strategy is how we get there. So we can't do anything until we decide what we want to do, then we decide, let's do it. So once we've decided on a strategy is no good unless we do anything about it. That's like saying, I'm the fastest runner in the world, I just can't be bothered to run. Or I'm a millionaire, I just don't want to show you any of my money. Until you do something with your strategy, it's useless. So you do actually have to implement it. Consequences of your strategy, so what happens because of your strategy, we have to think about what they might be and then monitor them as they are happening. So if we think that our strategy might lead to an increase in market share, well, we need to monitor whether that actually takes place. If it doesn't take place, then we need to change our strategy. We can't just keep plodding away with the same strategy if it's not working. I think a really good example of why a strategy is important was given to me when I was at university. So I'll share that with you now. And this is a true story. So there was an army detachment which were lost in the Alps in World War II. So the Alps are a mountain range in Central Europe. So they'd been chased around by a much larger German force, and they didn't really know where they were. They had very little food left, very little ammunition. They were injured, they were tired, they were pretty much ready to give up. They were just wandering around. Luckily they came across a shepherd's cottage in the middle of nowhere in the Alps. So the person who had kind of taken charge, for although their commanding officer had been killed, this person had taken charge. He went off, he was looking around the shepherd's hut, and he found what turned out to be a map. So he told his men, look, we've got a map, we'll be fine. That really raised everyone's spirits, it gave people a lot more energy. They decided, right, we'll have a night's sleep, and then we'll get off in the morning, we'll get ourselves safe. So in the morning, the men followed this guy with a map. 2 or 3 days later, they was found safely. He'd walked them to the nearest army base. The interesting thing was, when it all came to light, was this map was actually of the Pyrenees. It wasn't of the Alps. Pyrenees are hundreds of miles away in between France and Spain. They were in the Alps in Austria. So the moral of the story was that the map wasn't the important thing. It was the fact that that map had given those people who were lost and they were tired, it had given them some direction. So once they had direction, it made their decisions a lot easier. It meant that everyone was focused on the same thing, and then people were motivated. And that's why a strategy is important. It's not always that the right strategy is important, but a strategy will get everyone on side, it will make people motivated, it will make people realise what is important. And because of that, it draws the whole business together and it makes people want to succeed. Once again, we're lucky enough that I mark on this paper, so I can tell you what you need to do to gain a high mark. Now, this is something that the chief examiner always brings up, this idea of developing an integrated approach. Another way of thinking of the word integrated is joined up. So joined up thinking. So you can't just think of one functional area. You can't think of another functional area. You've got to think of how all the different functions impact on one another. So even if the question is focusing on marketing, how will marketing impact the other three functions? You've got to also think about long-term objectives. So how is what the business is doing going to impact their future long-term objectives? So one I'm thinking about straight away with the business that we have now is think about APSL. How is what they're doing now going to impact where they stand in the future? So think about the waste that they're producing. How is that going to impact them in the future? You've also got to consider stakeholders. So again, that could relate back to long-term objectives with APSL. Think of poor little Percy and the fact that he's having all that waste dumped on his ground. The environment. And as usual, I say this is not just the trees. So the external environment. You've got to think about how the external environment might impact upon APSL. So think about legislation. Think about different political parties. Think about how people react because of society. So think again about what the waste situation might be doing to APSL's image. Think about how technology might be changing. You've also got to consider the resources that are present in the case study. How is what resources APSL have going to influence what strategic decisions that they can make? Now this is something new. This is what I came up with a couple of years ago to help people remember what type of things that they need to talk about in their answers. So when you're doing any answer now, I want you to write this at the top of your response. So it kind of focuses you on what type of things you need to try to at least think about getting in your answers. So the S stands for stakeholders. Make sure you talk about stakeholders. The I stands for internal constraints. So what things inside the business might be stopping them doing what they want to do. D stands for the disadvantages or the negative things that might happen because of a certain strategy. E are the external constraints, so the things outside the business which might have an impact on our strategy. P, don't forget to prioritise. Most of the questions on this paper now, there'll be an evaluative element there, so make sure most important, least important. A, advantages, so what positive things might come out because of the strategies that we're suggesting. R, if necessary, for an evaluate question, make sure you actually do make a recommendation. And T, make sure you include timescale. So link that back to prioritization. Most important, least important, short term, long term. So this idea of the integrated approach is translated into objectives. So most businesses have them. Oh, there's my mistake for the day. They can be short term or they can be long term. They can be easy to achieve or difficult to achieve. Usually we'd say a difficult to achieve objective stretches a business, so it's a good idea, whereas easy to achieve objectives, because they're easy to achieve, they don't really pull the business any further forward. Bigger businesses tend to have more complex objectives because they've got more going on. Now these must be communicated. If we don't communicate our objectives, then they're useless. If we don't tell people what they're expected to achieve, they're never going to achieve them. The more people that we have in our organisations, the more objectives we need. Also, let's think about the fact it's not just the business, it's not just APSL who have objectives, stakeholders will have too. So the obvious example in the case study is Percy. He has his objective of to do with waste, which is going to cause a conflict, or it currently is causing a conflict. So take into account that the actions of the business will have an impact on its stakeholders and vice versa. Now, we have to bear in mind what we call a hierarchy of objectives. So hopefully you remember from Maslow last year, a hierarchy suggests that we go from most important to least important, or highest to lowest, something like that. In this case though, we go from long term to short term, or very vague to very specific. So it's kind of like a reverse hierarchy. So I'll draw you what I mean by that. So at the top of our objectives, we have mission statements. So a mission statement, now the reason I've drawn it upside down is because it's very wide. A mission statement is a very vague statement about what we want our business to achieve. It's a little bit like saying this is what our business believes in, if you like. Next, which we'll look at, are aims. So as you can see, they're a little bit less vague, so therefore they're a little bit more specific. Under that, we have strategic objectives. So again, a little bit less vague, therefore a little bit more specific. And then under that, we have tactical objectives. So as you're going down here, not only are you getting more specific, but they're also getting more short term. Now, sorry for people who don't like football, but I'm going to give a football analogy. A mission statement, say for instance for Manchester City, when they were taken over by their new owners, would be to become the biggest football club in the world. Now that's really vague. What do we mean by the biggest football club? The biggest ground, the biggest number of supporters? We don't know. It's quite vague. One of the ways that they do that is by winning as many cup competitions as possible, winning the Premier League as many times as possible. So that could be their aim. The strategic objective of getting that would be to buy as many, or to buy a new striker, to buy a new midfield player. But then very short term, very specific, are the tactics that they play over 90 minutes. So the tactics that they play will make sure that they can achieve the other things. So one leads to another. Hopefully everything that the business does will in some way go towards achieving their mission statement. So mission statements then, they set the business purpose. So a really famous one, which I mentioned further down here, was Nike in the 1980s and the 1990s. Their mission statement was simply destroy Reebok. So that tells their employees what they're all about. It tells their shareholders, it tells their stakeholders, and it sets the value of the business. So it means that everything that an employee does every day, they should be thinking, how is this helping me help our business to destroy Reebok? So the mission statement sets out a long-term vision. It's not specific, it's not saying how it's going to destroy Reebok, it's just saying what it wants to achieve. Lately, mission statements have definitely started including environmental issues. So I make a joke, but it could simply be destroy Reebok, but let's recycle more as well. Now, a mission statement isn't an end in itself. It must have a day-to-day impact on everything that the business does. So destroying Reebok had to have a day-to-day impact on Nike. They might have changed their advertising. It might have meant that they moved into different markets. So it's pointless having a mission statement unless it can be reflected in day-to-day activities. Next down the list then, aims and goals. So remember, these are slightly more specific ways, and they're how we're going to achieve the mission statement. So aims and goals will depend on the age of the business, the size of the business, the different type of markets that we're in, whether we're a public or a private sector business, and also the wishes or the priorities of the owner. So things like, if you remember from last year, these are to survive, to grow, to make profit, to increase market share, or increase stakeholder value. So for instance, if your business is very new, you're probably going to have survive as an objective. If your business is big already, it might have to be increase shareholder value. A grey area often means that we're combining these with strategic objectives, which is the next layer down. You're never going to be examined on which is the second layer in the hierarchy of objectives. All that I want you to understand is that each different type of objective or each different type of goal helps to achieve another. It's a little bit like a staircase. So you're climbing up the steps to get to your mission statement. So strategic objectives and objectives for the whole business. There's the key there. Remember, we're not focusing on individual functions at the moment. We're focusing on the whole business. These are for the long term, and they're determined by senior managers. So again, these might be things like survival, breaking even, increasing our market share or growth, or to make a profit. So remember, as I said, they're often mixed up with or joined in with aims that we saw previously. Now, tactical objectives, these are the most specific and more short term. So these are objectives set for departments. So you also might see them called functional objectives. So remember, marketing, production, finance, HR. So they might be set for departments or functions or groups of people. These are implemented at department level, this time by middle managers. These are often short-term targets. So remember, these are used to achieve the strategic objectives. So, like I said, they're like steps. So your tactical objectives here go on to your strategic objectives, which go on to your aims and objectives, and then hopefully help us achieve our mission statement. So one leads to another, leads to another. So that's why we have these different levels. Functional, individual people, and it shows how individual people can have an impact on the wider business. A mission statement doesn't achieve itself. We have to put these steps in place in order to help us get where we want to be, which is at our mission statement. Stakeholders have their own objectives as well. So what from APSL will customers want? Well, they might want the most high quality plastics. Employees might want stable employment to make sure they've always got a job. Banks might want to make sure that we're paying any loans back. Environmental and ethical pressure groups, particularly relevant in our case with the idea of waste. And suppliers, well, they want paying on time, but they also perhaps want us to expand, to be constantly buying new goods from them. Also, because if you think there is the possibility of changing our raw materials, so that new suppliers, they might also have objectives as well. Think about how these might conflict with one another in the case study that we have. So, environmental and ethical groups could clash with suppliers, for instance. So, this idea of conflict then. So, for example, shareholders want short-term profit. They want, if you buy shares in a business, you think, I want to see some profit in the next 6 months or a year. But that might directly conflict with what managers want. Managers might want to grow in the long term. In order to grow in the long term, a business might have to buy some new machinery. It might have to build a new factory. It might have to expand into a new market. But in order to do that, it means we're not going to get any short-term profit. So that's certainly going to have an impact on that. So either the shareholders get their way and they get money in the short term, or the managers get their way and they spend money for the long term. But there's going to be a conflict there. So as managers, which is what we've got to think of ourselves as for F297, we've got to think of how we can manage that. How can we keep both of those people happy? Same again, employees might want a good salary, but owners want to keep the costs down. As managers, how can we make sure that everyone is happy with that? Environmentalists, they want a low carbon footprint, but that might totally go against the fact that a manager wants a cheapest solution. So it's been cheap and easy for APSL to dump their waste on Percy's ground. But environmentalists and Percy, they want to have as little impact on the environment as possible. So that's why there's conflict. We have to bear in mind as well, when we think of a strategy, so remember, a strategy is our way of getting to where we want to be, we have to weigh up this idea of there being risk and reward. So depending on the type of company, the balance will be different. You have to think of the higher the risk, the higher the reward. So think gambling. If you bet £1, you might only get 50 pence back. But if you bet £1 million with the same odds, you might get £500,000 back. But it also means if it goes wrong, you've lost £1 million. So it's like that in business. If you risk more, you expect more in return. So this is often a theme of the questions that come out. Will the reward that we're expecting to gain be worth the risk? So drug companies, for instance, spend billions of pounds developing new drugs. And I'm not exaggerating there. A new drug will cost billions of pounds to develop. So some work, but some don't. So the ones that work pay massive rewards, but the ones that don't, they don't obviously make any reward. They've spent billions. So the ones that do work have to make sure that they pay for the ones that don't work. You may or you may not know, but a very scary fact is there's a lot of evidence that suggests that cancer treatments and AIDS treatments are a lot closer to fruition than drug companies might care to admit, but they aren't necessarily going to release them until the market conditions are right for them to make up for the costs they've incurred to develop them. So at the moment, a lot of drug companies think that the reward isn't actually worth them releasing these drugs yet because the risk is still too great. Other businesses might be risk averse, and therefore they won't take on new or risky projects. So banks are becoming like this because they got in so much trouble. So think about APSL. What risks are there and what rewards are there? Will the risks outweigh the rewards, or will the rewards outweigh the risks? So let's think about what they're trying to achieve, and are the risks of that good enough for them to take it? I'll try to do this as much as I can. I'll talk about, when we do a topic, I'll say what type of analysis points might you be asked to look at, or can you put in answers, what type of evaluation points. So in terms of objectives then, you could discuss the effect of choosing a particular objective on revenue, for instance. So by APSL changing or possibly having an objective of improving waste, what impact could that have in the short term on revenue and the long term revenue? Well, in the short term, they might have to spend more on getting rid of the waste rather than developing their product, so that could have a negative impact. But in the long term, if they get it right, then they might get a better image, so that have a good impact on their revenue, for instance. You also might have to discuss the effect of these objectives on a variety of stakeholders. So for instance, growth may mean a smaller dividend for shareholders because they've had to pay for equipment and premises, but it might have a positive impact on employees because their jobs are more secure. So always think about what impacts your objectives or the objectives of the company are going to have, and also think about what things the company are doing are going to have, what impact they're going to have on their actual objectives. And finally, same again, so I'll think about what type of evaluation points. So you'll need to weigh up all the implications of potential objectives. So think back to the analysis points we've just said. So who will be impacted the most by the objectives? So will shareholders be impacted the most? Will managers be impacted the most? Will Percy be impacted the most? Will it be Katie who's impacted the most? Will it be Katie in the short term? Will it be Percy in the long term? Who's going to have the most impact? Who's going to have the least impact? Will the marketing function be impacted the most by the objective? Will it be HR? Will it be HR today but finance in the future? So remember, it's all about this idea of weighing up. Most important, least important. So that's the P of side part and the T of side part. Prioritization and timescale.